Hi, I'm David Fetter, Executive Editor Technical for Prepared Foods, and I want to welcome you to a Prepared Foods special presentation on trends in kosher and halal certification in product development. With us today is Dr. Joe Regenstein. Dr. Regenstein is perhaps the leading authority on these two religion-based certifications in the academic world today. He is Professor Emeritus of Food Science, head of the Kosher and Halal Food Initiative in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, that's at Cornell University. He has a PhD in biophysics from Brandeis. He's won too many awards to count over the years for career service, efforts to promote multicultural diversity, outstanding accomplishments in science and public policy. He was IFT's first Congressional Science Fellow, and he has served on IFT's executive committee. He's author and editor of numerous books and articles across dozens of publications, both scientific and popular. And he served on the Food Market Institute and with Dr. Temple Grandin on the American Veterinary Medicine Association's Humane Slaughter Guidelines panel. Whew! And that's a drop in the bucket. I'm also proud to call him a longtime friend. Welcome, Dr. Regenstein.
Thank you for having me. It's fun to have a chance to talk about these topics.
And it's always great to hear you talk about them. It goes without saying that religious certification requires not only a great deal of care and focus on diverse and intricate elements, but also calls for a very high level of sensitivity. I mean, after all, the goal is to satisfy not only the consumers of these products, but the highest power. So, how does a food and beverage maker start out when it comes to getting approved for either of these certifications?
Okay, that's actually one of the hardest steps in the process. Again, it is important to do due diligence. And I think sometimes companies kind of get themselves into kosher and pick one agency that they've heard about. And they need to think about the different kinds of agencies and which ones will serve their needs best. They also need to look at their own product to have a rough idea of whether it can be kosher or halal, and we'll cover that separately. Let me say a few words about certifiers. In the area of kosher, you have basically three broad areas of certification. You have those agencies that are what I call normative mainstream, and that's a basically operational definition. These are the large and small agencies whose products are, relatively speaking, interchangeable. That is, if you have any one of these certifications, they're acceptable by consumers who use those certifications, and restaurants, kosher restaurants or kosher food service that may be under one of those supervisions. So that's kind of the largest number of the supervisions. Then there are a group that are more lenient, and they sometimes allow a company to obtain kosher certification, though its application and acceptability will be more limited. So there are situations that justify using the more liberal ones because they're not quite mainstream, and some people will use them and some consumers will not. The third group is what I call the Hasidic or fervently Orthodox groups. Those groups usually do their own supervision for their own communities. What they will generally do is go to a normative mainstream operation, and rather than inspect them occasionally, they will have somebody on site all the time. Again, those are the three types of agencies. Within each of these categories, some are large international, some are large national, some are local. If you are taking a local if you're doing something like bread or a restaurant or local ice cream shop or a bakery, having the local is probably the easiest because some of these types of places need constant supervision or at least daily supervision. And it's a lot easier if it's a local supervisor who can do that. If you have a product that you're looking at national distribution, you certainly want an agency that's large enough that that the product is recognized by consumers across the country. The other thing are issues of cost, availability of supervision, and responsiveness. An important piece is responsiveness. In the halal world, there are many fewer agencies. Many of them are more likely to be individuals, though there are some larger agencies that, again, are working both domestically and, again, in some cases, internationally. And one certainly quality control check on the Muslim side is the agency approved for usage in one or more of the large Muslim countries? If you're working on a retail product, the choice of agencies is partly design fits your product. The important point I want to make for some of your listeners is if you're an ingredient manufacturer, that is, you're planning to sell your material to another food company, you absolutely have to be normative mainstream. There is no point in being certified with a more lenient certification because many companies are purchasing your product are kosher supervised, and that's where it's important that the agency be one that other agencies accept and respect. So that's one of the challenges.
Right. Also, so you could have your product being manufactured where the product itself might be under a more lenient certification, but you have to know that the ingredients are more, I guess you could say, more universal
Right,
for
right.
application. So, well, now you mentioned halal certification having fewer agencies, and it is fairly new to the U.S. anyway.
Certainly, their rules have an overlap with kosher, but they also have some major differences.
Right. I was
Uh,
going to ask you about that. How does halal differ from the already well established kosher? So,
right. The big difference is that a few of the big differences, I should say, the biggest difference in my mind is that the allowed animals, what animals are acceptable as halal, is larger in both mammals and birds than kosher. Kosher has very narrow prescription of what is acceptable animals for humans to eat. Uh, Muslims have a larger collection. Commercially, the important ones that they have that kosher doesn't are the are animals like camels and rabbits, ostrich and its kind are the big commercial differences. The commonality, of course, is pork. If you wanted to use a kosher beef gelatin, it is extremely expensive, and fish gelatin, which functions slightly different. So you have a different functionality that you have to add into your product development, but it can be both positive and negative depending on what functions you're using. That material is significantly more expensive than non-kosher gelatin, but is nowhere near as outrageously expensive as beef gelatin. And
okay.
we are seeing fish gelatin being used in product development, um, particularly for products that are uniquely designed for Jewish markets and Muslim markets. But we're also seeing a few products with a broader audience that are using fish gelatin. The big difference from a functionality for product development point of view is that the melting point is lower.
Hmm.
That can be an asset or it can be a liability depending on the
Gotcha.
product. And with fish gelatins, particularly blending fish gelatins, you can actually get a range of melting points
Wow.
because cold water fish melt at very low temperatures or don't even set as a gel because their melting point is too low to actually function, to things like tilapia gelatin, which is being made commercially, which has almost as high a melting temperature as beef and pork gelatins.
All
So
right.
there's a whole range there.
So we've talked about the meat animals. What about seafood? Are there any proscriptions? Of course, in kosher, only fish with fins and scales, which rules out shellfish, mollusks, etc. But what about halal? Does that have any?
That's one of the other areas where halal, technically, the Quran says anything that spends its entire life in the water is halal. This is an
Gotcha.
area where there is great deal of disagreement. The Shia community, some of them essentially have moved back to kosher,
Huh.
which is they only will use fish with fins and scales. Others really will follow almost anything that meets that in the water criteria. And what that actually means in many countries is people consider halal mainly fish and shellfish that they recognize. So even though the different schools in the Sunni community have different degrees of strictness, people from different countries within the same school will accept different fish, recognizing that on the kosher side, there are still many areas also still debated.
I know
Both
there are some
religions
fish.
are,
Yeah,
are comfortable with some degree of debate. As somebody
marlin.
who, pardon?
Marlin, the marlin fish. I've heard two different thoughts on that because it has fins and scales when it's born, and then it loses them as it gets older, or is it
That's
vice
also the
versa?
claim for swordfish, which is probably the most controversial. And I've
Right.
spent a fair bit of time on trying to understand the biology of juvenile swordfish.
Maybe
I'm
that's the one I was thinking of. Starts out with fins and scales, and then ends up with no
Well, that's what they
scales.
say, but it's
Yeah.
not clear that the pattern of juvenile scales is in fact acceptable as
Ah,
scales from a kosher point of view.
got it.
So, one of the problems in all of these things is that you're looking at texts that are fairly old historically. And when you come to things like identification of species, it's not clear that we actually know what species these ancient texts
Ah, gotcha. We've only
were.
got the original Arabic or Hebrew, depending on halal kosher, and it might be a word that's been used once, so has no translation. I get that. Let's jump over to alcohol because I know that
Right, I wanted to
alcohol,
get to that too.
yeah, go for it.
Alcohol is one of those interesting things on both kosher and halal. Um, on the kosher side, there is a great deal of concern with any liquid juice derivative from grapes. So the area of grapes is a highly specialized area in kosher. In most cases, the plant kingdom is fairly innocuous, other than the 1 week of Passover.
Right.
The source of alcohol does matter for kosher, but alcoholic beverages can be prepared and are used. The Muslims have a ban on alcohol. That plays out a little more complicated than just saying no alcohol. Anything that's involved with beverage alcohol is pretty much forbidden. Industrial alcohol of course, is used as an extractive to optimize things like vanilla extract, etc. The different agencies do have different rules. Afanca, the largest Muslim agency in this country, is probably set the rough framework of what is currently acceptable. What they require is that if you are going to use an extractive alcoholic, and alcohol, by the way, I mean strictly ethanol, ethyl alcohol, period. All the other alcohols are not included. If they're edible, you can use them. If they're methanol, I hope you never use them.
Right.
What they require is that you can use the extraction, but you then have to dry the extract down to less than 0.5% alcohol. And remember, extractives by law are generally over 35% alcohol. So you've got to do a full drying, and the finished products have to have less than 0.1% alcohol. Now, some of the natural products run a little bit higher than that. Vinegar, bread are products that have some small amount of residual alcohol. Vinegar, because it's made from alcohol. Bread, because you're fermenting yeast to CO2 and alcohol. And that's acceptable. If it's a product that has natural alcohol and nothing has been done to allow it to excessively ferment, those are generally acceptable in the Muslim community.
Okay. Would an ultra high temperature processing would that count as drying out the alcohol? Well, I'm guessing if whatever you do to it, if you end up with that less than 0.1%, you're in the clear. Is that correct?
Correct. But
Got it.
again, ultra high processing is usually done in a container, so you wouldn't be volatilizing the alcohol. And while we're talking about alcohol, just to point out to folks, the USDA has done a study and has shown that if you add something like vanilla extract and boil it for 2 hours, you still will have measurable alcohol remaining. The idea that all of the alcohol volatilizes very easily appears not to be true. It has not been reduplicated, and I don't remember the actual amounts, but alcohol is measurable even after some fairly heavy-duty processing. Small amounts, some of which, depending on the agency, would be acceptable for halal. Others, agencies may not accept that approach. So again, that is where, again, you need to talk to the agency and learn what the different agencies for halal that you might consider, what their alcohol standard is if you are planning to use something, an alcohol-based extract as part of your flavors. Now, there are flavor houses that have extracts that they use. They will formulate with isopropyl alcohol or one of the other legal alcohols for Muslims, so that, in fact, this is not an issue. Now, the problem there is that the flavor profile of those flavors is slightly different and probably slightly less well-rounded and slightly less ideal.
Now, I know you mentioned in conversation with me one time that you've been working hard lately on trying to help halal be a little bit better. And you just mentioned it in passing, but I'd like you to tell our audience, what do you mean by making halal a little better? And how are you going about doing this?
One of the things, working with Dr. Temple Grandin at Colorado State University, who is probably the expert on livestock animal welfare, the knives used by Muslims are all sorts of knives. And she has found observationally that the slaughter knife that's used by Jewish slaughtermen, which is a very straight edge and is larger than twice the width of the neck, really is the way to go. And so, one of the things we're trying to do is develop a Muslim knife that is standardized and of high quality, that is a straight edge, because they'll use curved knives, etc. We want to work with the Muslim community on getting their knives a bit sharper than they generally do. The kosher knife is sharpened to a very, very high level of sharpness. And the most important piece about a knife in kosher slaughter is that it is nick free. There are no nicks on the knife. And if you see a Jewish slaughterman, he will take the knife and run it over his nails to find the nicks.
Wow.
And they're trained to find these nicks. And in fact, I tell the story of one of my colleagues, a rabbi, who went to the rabbi to be trained. And the first thing the rabbi did is gave him a knife and said, find the nicks, because that's a skill that you either have or don't have. And he wasn't even going to train the person if he couldn't find the nicks. And he came back the next day and said, I found two. There's one here and there's one here. And the guy handed him back the knife and said, when you find all 14, then I will start teaching you.
Whoa.
And that is what catches and causes pain when one is using a knife slaughter. And so we also are working with the Jewish community to hopefully get some videos prepared, working on what are the correct whetstones to use, and to find a processor, to a knife maker, to make these knives in quantity at a reasonable cost. And that is the kind of program we're putting together so that the quality of religious slaughter in the Muslim community can be improved. I must say, I have talked about this in the Muslim community, and they are very, very receptive. The issue is finding a knife maker. I've talked to a lot of knife makers, and none of them are willing to take the risk because these knives are bigger than their normal knives. And so it will require some retooling. So the big thing I've come to the conclusion is that we need a sponsor who will put up the money up front to work with a company to give them the resources to make the changes, to make the investment, and recover the investment over time. And this would be a place where they could make a major, major improvement, since halal really does focus a great deal on the slaughter.
Well, I'll tell you, if any in our audience have any interest in that, with more than 1 billion people to serve, it could be a lucrative investment for whoever does make the investment. So in looking at the differences between kosher and halal, even though we've gone over many of them, although not, a drop in the bucket, but we have gone over many of them. Overall, they seem relatively few. Now, I know it's not possible for certain items to bear both marks, but many items can and many items do. So how are kosher and halal going to work together in the coming years and beyond? Are there any advances that we've had in merging those two when it comes to those certain areas where they can overlap?
There are certainly products out there that are what we call dual certified. At this time, if one is kosher certified, some of the Muslim agencies will use some of the kosher paperwork, some of the material that the company has already prepared for kosher, and review it, and it becomes fairly straightforward to get the halal mark. I don't anticipate at this time that we will have any kosher supervisions giving out Muslim certification in the mainstream. There, I think, have been one or two attempts to give Muslim certification on what would be the lenient end of the organizational structure. Again, the Muslim rules of being a certifier are less strict. In practice, all kosher certifications have at least one rabbi involved in the process. Muslims, basically, any practicing Muslim can begin to have a certifying agency.
Really?
And that has led to a larger range of options. One could argue a larger range of quality, but I want to be respectful because, again, many of these lenient agencies, both on the kosher and halal side, reflect genuine differences of opinion. And again, in both cases,
and of scripture.
It's interpretation of scripture,
right,
and the fact that there is no court of last resort. There is no Supreme Court.
Listen, Dr. Regenstein, I want to thank you for that deep dive into the current state of kosher and halal certification in food product development and manufacturing. This has been, like I said, we just skimmed the surface. There's so much more to get into. What I'd like to do is sometime, and I hope our audience would be interested in this, sometime let's you and I have a session like this, a podcast or a video or both like this, where we discuss the upcoming cell-based animal protein products. It's a talk for another time, but I think it's timely. So let's plan on that. So thank you again, Dr. Regenstein. Thank you, listeners, for joining us. This is Dr. Joe Regenstein in a prepared foods presentation on trends in kosher and halal certification. I hope you enjoyed the first-person discussion we've had today. I invite you to check out our comprehensive coverage of all the on-trend topics of interest to food and beverage formulators and manufacturers at preparedfoods.com. And while you're there, check out our media menu. You'll find more podcast videos, infographics, webinars, articles from top experts in the industry.